So your first assignment is due next week. It's now on Blackboard. You can find it in the assignments tab, but I want to go through all the requirements. Okay. So you have a week to do it. It's due next Monday night. It's not that big. You only have 3 pages. I think 3 pages is enough you can build in a week. Okay. So it's due by midnight next Monday night. It's 25% of your final mark. To submit, you have to zip up all your files and upload them to Blackboard, as well as you have to give me the links to your pages on the server so I can run them. Okay? It's an independent assignment, so you have to do this on your own. You can't work with somebody else. You can't give me an assignment that is the same as somebody else's. Okay? And the other thing I want to mention is you can use anything I put on Blackboard as a reference. I do not want to see my own files with the words changed. I know my own code and I know my own comments, and when people take the files off Blackboard and just change the variable names and give me my own work back, I know. I've been writing code for a long time, so I know my own work when I see it. If you give it to me, I'm not going to mark it. Okay, so the idea here is not to take what I put on Blackboard, just save a copy, change the words, and give it back to me for a mark. That's not how it's going to work. Okay? So you have to do it yourself. By all means, you can look at anything on Blackboard, use it as a reference. You have to code the stuff on your own. So what are you going to build? Well, you can build whatever the heck you want, okay? I've given you, oh, sorry, I thought my screen was on. I've given you a few samples of what you could choose to build. So you can build any kind of web application you want, so long as it meets the requirements for the assignment, okay? So you'll need to build 3 PHP pages. You're going to need to create at least 2 tables in your database. You'll need a form for capturing user input. And the form has to include a drop-down list that's filled from the database, not a drop-down list that you've hard-coded the options in the HTML. The drop-down list will be dynamic, so if there's a new option in your database, that option automatically is added to your drop-down with PHP script. We'll learn how to do that today. It's not very difficult. You'll have to validate all the user inputs, so somebody can't just fill out the form and leave it blank and submit it. You'll have to save the data to a table, and then you'll have to build a page that's similar to Lab 1 that outputs all of the records that are saved to your database in a grid using HTML table tags. And your application should also send an email. So for example, if there's a box on there where I can fill in my email address, I should get an email message when I'm done saving the form. Also, you should be commenting your code as we've been doing with all the files in class. There should be some comments. Most of you put comments in your lab, which was great. A few people left them out. You didn't lose any marks if you didn't put comments in the lab, but you will lose a few marks if you don't put comments in the assignment. Okay, so this is something I want you to get used to doing. So here are the requirements in a bit more detail. Basically, all of the inputs on your form are going to be required. So there can't be any fields that are left blank. If there are, you have to show the user what they've done wrong and let them fix their form before they submit and save the data. Okay. So I've given you a sample. I think I showed you this last week. So there's a link here. So here's my little 3-page application. So the first thing I'm going to get is a form. So the very first thing I'm going to do when I get your form is I'm just going to hit the save button right away and make sure that you're using some kind of input validation. Okay. So then I'll fill out all the form fields. I'll also check your PHP code file that you're using a SQL select query and PHP to fill your drop-down list. I'll want to make sure it's saved, and then I should be able to get a list, or you might even redirect me automatically if you can figure out how to do that. That's fine. Give me a link to then go see your HTML table. So this is pretty much what you did for your lab. Right? And here's the record that I just added. I'll be able to see that that record got recorded. That's it. I would consider this to be, the only other thing is I would have put in my own email address and make sure that I get an email link. Other than that, I'd consider this a 100% assignment. Okay, so 3 pages. So I don't care what data you use. I don't care what information you build or what your form looks like. Build something, build some little application. You know, you want to build an application that tracks all of your assignment due dates at school? Great. You want to track you have a part-time job, your work schedule. You want to make a grocery list for when next time you need to go to the grocery store. You're going to be able to add food and see a shopping list that you could pull up on your phone when you're grocery shopping. Doesn't matter to me. You want to build a music library, build any little 3-page application. So there's the form, there's the save page, and there's the output table of all the data. Okay, so everybody's should be different because I'm allowing you to, I'm not giving you one assignment and everyone has to build the same thing, right? I'm encouraging you to build something that you want to build that is involved with something you're interested in or that's useful for you. So I shouldn't get 2 that are the same. And please don't copy mine. This is a sample to give you an idea of what you're doing. Don't just take mine and rebuild it. Build something of your own, please. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? So in the document, the link is here, so you can run that in the browser, and here are the screenshots of the application. Okay. So I have used Bootstrap. I'm not giving you any marks for the design in CSS, but it's not a bad idea that you at least use either a basic style sheet of your own or a pre-existing one like Bootstrap or Foundation, just so you can make your application look a little more polished. Again, when you guys are out job hunting for fall co-ops, the first thing employers are going to want to know is, well, what have you built that you can show me? So the more little applications you have and the better they look, the more that's going to help you get a job. Okay, so you don't have to get carried away with the design. I'm not marking the design, but I would recommend you at least apply some basic CSS styling to it. Any questions at all? Is there anything not clear? Does everybody know exactly what you need to do? My suggestion is it's due Monday night. I would get started on it sooner rather than later because first of all, you'll have today's lesson fresh in your mind. Second of all, I do have some office hours over the next few days, so if you need help, you can come next door and you can see me and get help, right? If you leave this till the weekend, well, on the weekend, I won't be sitting at the computer waiting for your emails to come in on the weekend, right? So the sooner you start, the more time you have. If you run into a problem, you can come and ask me for help or send me an email. And here's how I'm going to grade you. So a couple marks just for building your tables, and the 3 main parts of the assignment: inserting new data, which we did 2 weeks ago, querying the database, so that'll be 4 marks for building your HTML table and 4 marks for populating the drop-down list from the database query, 8 marks for validating the data, and then a couple marks for email and code commenting. I'll give you up to 2 bonus marks for any other functionality you implement with PHP that we haven't gone over in class. So anything you show me you've learned independently. If you add 1 extra feature and you get it working, I'll give you 1 mark. If you add 2 extra features with PHP, I'll give you 2 marks. So I'm happy to give out marks that are 34 out of 32. More than happy to do it if you want to spend the time to extend it and take this a little farther. If you do, my suggestion is get all of the main requirements working first. Don't spend time on the bells and whistles first. Get it working, and then if you're done and you have time, then add some extra things if you want to challenge yourself. But that way, if you don't get those working, you haven't cost yourself marks on the main requirements. Always do the core functionality first. Okay, so this is on Blackboard in the Assignments tab, and you've got until next Monday night at midnight to submit that. Okay. So, if for the assignment I'm going to evaluate your ability to populate a drop-down and your ability to validate form inputs, those are things we better do today. So you have all the pieces that you need. You already have most of the pieces for this, but I'll give you the rest. Almost everybody in the class did the lab, which was great. I think there are only 2 students who I didn't get a lab from, which is good. And by and large, everybody, pretty much, if you submitted the lab, you got your 2.5%, pretty much. which is good. I'll just enable this solution file here so you can see it if you want the code, but I think pretty much everybody had it, for the most part, working the way it needed to work. Okay. I'm going to jump into course documents for a minute. The other thing I'm going to try to do, I'm doing as a little experiment. I know a few of the other teachers have tried this. I'm going to try screencasting my lessons and sticking them up on YouTube. I'm going to do this for a couple reasons. One is if you can't be here, you basically can still participate in the class. I've also had a few students say, I can't code everything and listen to you at the same time. So what advice, what could you do? So a few people have suggested if I could record the lessons and then they could watch them again at home, that would help. Or if you get stuck on something, you could then go to YouTube and watch the code samples we do together in class and hear the explanations again, start, fast forward, and pause. So I don't know whether I'll continue to do this. I'm going to try this for a bit. I'll see if anybody's watching them, and B, what kind of feedback I get, if it's actually helpful for anybody. If it's not, I won't bother, but if it's helping people, it's really not a big effort on my part to do. So we'll give that a try. So after today, not only will I post the files, but after it takes me 4 hours to upload the video, I'll also put the YouTube links inside the lesson 4 folder. So if you want to see any part of the lesson again, I'll probably do 3 sections, right? The first, second, and third hour, I'll do 3 different videos. And I'll put those up on YouTube. I think I'll try that for the next month or so. And maybe you guys can give me some feedback on if you think there's any value. If you don't, I won't bother. But if it's helping people, then I can continue to do it. So I want to do a quick review of last week. Got a quick task for you, a 5-minute task. Okay? I want you to work with either 1 or 2 people that are sitting next to you. And what I want you to do is write down, if you can, put them on a piece of paper. If not, type them up in an email. Write 3 questions about what we learned last week for selecting and displaying data, how we do that with PHP. So you have 5 minutes. I want you to write down 3 questions, and then you're going to trade your questions with another group and answer each other's questions. Okay? I could give you a review on Blackboard where I make the questions. I'm going to give you guys a chance to do it yourself. It's not for marks. So you have 5 minutes. Write down 3 questions about selecting data using PHP. Okay? So find 1 partner or 2 partners.
You weren't recording that? They need to know all that.
I was not recording that. Okay, so last week in class we did, where was our page? So we built this page where we were selecting and we were putting our data in an HTML table, and the same for your lab. Your lab looked pretty much the same. So for your assignment, what we need to do, if we think about the process we talked about last week, anytime we're selecting data, I'll just go back in, pull up my lovely artwork from last week about how selecting data works. Right, anytime we're retrieving data, our page is going to request something, so we're going to connect to the database, we're going to run a query. Thank you. We're going to connect, run a query, fetch some data, and send it back. And then the only question is, how are we going to present it? So last week, both in your lab and in class, we used a series of HTML table tags for building grids, right? So there was our in-class file, and here was our lab file. They look pretty similar. So now what we want to do this time is go through most of the same steps. We still want to connect to the database. We want to run a query, fetch some data. We want to print it out on the screen and disconnect. But instead of showing the data in rows and columns, what we want to do is filter it into a drop-down list. So we want to be able to query a table and use that kind of wrapping instead. So we won't need any table tags. We won't need tags we used last week likethead, tbody, tr, td. We're going to need 2 different HTML tags in order to present our data this way, our query result. what 2 HTML tags are we going to need for this?
Select an option.
You got it. So Yash, can you explain before we look at the HTML, what will the select tag do and what will the option tag do?
Select will create the drop down with the arrow.
Yep, select creates the drop-down list. It'll create an empty drop-down list.
Option gives the options.
Right, and we're going to have the options wrapped. So if we go ahead and look at the HTML, here's our select tag. I've given it a name of position, good descriptive name of what it does. And then inside of our loop, we've got a PHP loop that queries the database, and it sets out an open and creates an opening and closing option tag, and then it prints the value from my query in between the option tags. So this is what you'll need to do with your assignment. Every web application you'll ever build is going to include dynamic drop-downs. We fill them all the same way. So it's something pretty straightforward, but we need to practice doing it. So this is what we're going to do next. So we're going to need to get connected to the database, because what I want to do is we're going to populate the database with a few tables, and then we can write some queries to fill drop-downs based on those tables. Now I made this countries table. This script is from last week. I'm just going to edit it for a second, so don't grab it yet. I'm just going to make a change. I usually try to put countries that represent every student in my class, but I think I'm looking around, I think we're missing a few. So what do I need to add? What countries should we add to the list before we run this query in the database?
Venezuela.
Okay.
El Salvador.
Okay. Anybody else in the class from any other country that we don't already have in the list? If so, I want to add it to our list.
Japan not there.
Nope, Japan's not there, so I'll add that. Mauritius? Okay. Brighto, tell me if I spell it Mauritius. Did I spell it right?
Yep.
Okay. Anything else? Any others I need to add to the list? Or do we have a complete list covering everybody in the class? If you didn't show up today, you don't count. You got to be here to get your country in the list. Okay, so I'll just edit this script. Just give me a second to save my changes. I forgot to put my brackets in around each value. Okay, so I think this represents probably everybody and probably a few countries additional, so I'm just going to save that. And actually, I'll just copy this into our Lesson 4 folder for you for today. So if you can connect to my SQL Workbench, or you can connect through the PHP My Admin site in your browser, but please log into your database on DreamHost. I'm just going to use my browser. So I'm just going to go to sql.computerstudies in the browser. I think I already have these tables, but I'm going to drop them and recreate them. So then I'll just copy the script from Blackboard. So when you run it, it should create 3 tables. A countries table that will put in our list of countries, provinces table that will insert our list of provinces, as well as a request table which will be blank. And we'll populate that later with a request page we build. Okay, we're back. So I'm going to open up my code editor. I'm going to open up Expression Web. And the first thing we're going to do is build a page that will just include a simple drop-down list that gets populated from the list of countries in our countries table. So if we had some kind of registration page or address book where people were filling in their address, they would need to pick their country. Or we might even have a drop-down list like this even on the front page or in the header of our site, right? Maybe we had a business where we had offices in different places around the world or in different languages, so we would want the user to pick their country. So we'd want to be able to fill that list from our database. So I'm going to go in and make a new PHP file. I'm going to call it select country.php. And I'm going to save it in a lesson 4 folder for today, so it's separate from all the other stuff we've done so far. And I'll make a Tuesday folder as well. So I'll call it select country. Save it here. So we want to fill a drop-down list. A drop-down list is a form control. So whenever we have a drop-down, we're always going to want to need to put it inside of an HTML form tag. So just like we did 2 weeks ago when we were building input forms, we'll need to start off with a form. And we want to set a couple of attributes. So basically, we're going to want to let the user pick a country, click a button, it'll take them to the next page, and we should be able to display what country they picked in the list. Okay, so we don't need tons of code for this. We want to set 2 attributes on our form. Which of the 2 attributes do we need? We can ignore most of what's here. So we'll want the action. So, and we get the code prompt, pick a URL. So we'll maybe call our next page show country.php. So that's one attribute. What's the other attribute that we want to set?
Method?
Yeah, we want to set the method. It's Darcy, correct?
Yes.
Okay, which method do we want?
Post?
You got it. We're going to use post. Now, we talked a couple weeks ago, we talked about the difference between post and get, and that get was actually the default. So if I leave that code out entirely, my form's going to use get instead. What's the difference between the two?
You can see the values in get this one.
With which one?
Get.
Right, so if we use get, whatever values are in our form, they show up as part of the URL. So it's much less secure than using post. So most of the time we're going to use post. So we'll close our form. And we'll just put on a div. And we'll put on a label. And we'll use a select tag. And we'll give that drop-down list the name country. So the select tag will render as a HTML drop. That gives us an HTML drop-down list. If I jump into the split view, we can see we get an empty drop-down list because there are no options inside of it yet. So if we have a couple of choices here. We could just type in option tags. We can type in a whole bunch of option tags like this with our different values. But most of the time we're going to use server-side script and fill our drop-down from an SQL query instead. What are some of the reasons why we would use an SQL query to populate the drop-down rather than just hard-coding in our choices?
Because you can add different choices to the SQL script.
Okay, that would be one, right? If we use this drop-down on different pages, if we want to add a new choice, we have to go into every page that has, say, a country drop-down and add that country. It's much more efficient to just insert that record in the database in the countries table, and all of a sudden every country drop-down on our site has that new option. That's probably the best reason. You think of any other reasons? Well, also, if we want to store that value in some other table in our database, we want to store their selection, we can be sure it's going to match with our other table in our database. Okay, so it's much more scalable and saves us, makes it maintaining and growing our site much easier if we're going to use the database to fill these. So inside our select, I'm going to put in PHP tags. So we're going to write our server-side script here. And I realize what time it is. We can go through this process. We probably need 5 minutes, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. So we'll put all the comments in just like we did last week. We'll plan out the steps first, and then we'll add the PHP code after. So step 1 is going to be what? Yeah, we're going to need to connect to the database, because all the values live in the database. We're going to need to get connected before we can access those values. So that'll be step 1. What will we do next? Yep, you got it, Fred. We will set up the SQL query to get the countries. Okay, so that'll be step 2. What should we do after that? We're connected, we've written an SQL statement. So we'll execute the query and we'll store the results. So we'll put that query result set into a variable. So now we have all the data we need in memory on our page. PHP can access those values. So how do we get those values into the drop-down list? So we'll loop through each result. And I'll just tab this next comment because this will happen inside of our loop. And we'll output so instead of using TRs and TDs like we did last week, we're going to use option tags instead. Right? We're just changing the wrapping or the packaging around our data from grid packaging to drop-down packaging. And what's the last thing we've got to do?
Disconnect.
Yep, let's free up that connection for another request. So we've done almost all of this last week. There's really only one line of code that's going to be different, right? It's going to be this section here where we're outputting the values. We're going to be including option tags, which we didn't use before. Last week we were using TRs and TDs. Everything else we're doing is identical to what we already did when in your lab and in the in-class work last week. So the first thing we'll do is create a new connection. A bit of a gotcha here. Walking around last week, a few people had errors because they had switched this and it said new POD. PDO is the right abbreviation. It stands for PHP Data Objects. And now we've got to supply the same 5 pieces of information we did before. So what kind of database are we connecting to? What's my SQL? Yeah, our host is sql.computerstudies. Whoops, thank you, I forgot host equals. Then we need our database name. And as a few of you found out the hard way last week, you can't have any spaces anywhere in this connection line or it crashes. I see a few nods and smiles, right? So if you leave a space here, a space there, the whole line will crash. So that entire parameter has to be without any spaces. And then you'll put in your username and password. So that should give us a connection if we've put in our credentials properly. And I'm going to enable SQL debugging. So if we have any SQL errors, those messages aren't suppressed, we'll actually see them. So without that line, if we type something wrong in our SQL query, we're not going to get any error message. If we enable this line, we're going to be able to see that error message so we can fix it. Our SQL query should be pretty simple. If we go back to our database for a minute and look at our table, we only have one field in the table. So what's our SQL query going to be? Select star. So that should give us the result we want. And if we're not sure if that'll give us the result, well, I'll just copy this. I can dump this into the query editor here in the phpMyAdmin site and see whether the result is what I want. Well, it's almost what I want. How could we make this a little bit better? It's giving us the right data. What do you think about the way the data is presented to us?
You need to.
Yeah, we probably want it in alphabetical order from A to Z would maybe make more sense. So what should we add on to the end of our query?
ASC.
Not quite. You're on the right track, Yash. So if we edit, what should we add at the end so that the countries are sorted in alphabetical order from A to Z? What SQL? We need 2 words. You maybe haven't done this yet in your database class. No. Okay, so what we need is an order by clause. So if we order by the country column, now it sorts alphabetically. So we'll maybe add that on. Our page will work without that. It's going to look a little better and be easier for people to use if we add on the order by. So we'll add that into our SQL command. Our execution of the query, storing of the result, and starting our loop, all that code's identical to what we did last week. No changes. So we'll create a command object. Using the prepare method of our connection. And then we'll allow our command to execute the query. And we'll store the result in a variable I'm going to call result. So if I open my lab file or I open my athletes file from last week, those 3 lines will be identical. And you don't have to take my word for it. Here's the file. Right? Exact same code. So now we'll use our for each loop. We'll loop through our entire set of data. And inside of our loop, how do we get the display that we need? So we're going to loop through one country at a time. How do we output the country with the proper HTML formatting around it so that each country will go inside of our dropdown? So we'll use echo. Yep, we'll use an option. We'll open an option tag before each country. What do we do after we create a new option tag? Yeah, we'll close that. And now how do we get the country name to come after it?
Row, square, brackets.
So we'll use the append operator. We'll use the period for appending. And now we'll use our row array, which only has a single column called country. And then how do we close that one? Because we want each country to appear in a new option.
Oh, no, slash, which you close the option.
So now we need to close the option this way. It's not it doesn't self-close. We have to add the ending tag after it. So for every country, we're going to create a new option tag, stick the country name in it, and close the tag. And then when we're done, we'll release our connection from memory. So this should be everything that we need to fill that drop down. So I'm going to try and load my page in the browser. So here's our drop down with all the countries coming from our database sorted in the order that we asked for, alphabetically from A to Z.